It's great to have met all of you today and yesterday and the day before, and I wasn't planning on closing out the conference, but we've got a QR code up here, and we're going to make this a little bit interactive, okay? So pull out your phones, and you probably have a note-taking app on your phones. You took a note. If you do something, this will drop you into a common document that we're all in. So if you want to use your note app on your phone to write yourself a note while we're going through this presentation, do that and then copy and paste it into the common note thing. So everybody's got that QR code. You know, I wish I had a flip phone. One without GPS tracking in it. We published earlier this year in a Wall Journal on privacy issues. So, yeah, let's see. How's this not? Okay. So it originally designed, this presentation was before the other one, so forgive some of those things. To kind of recap though, contributor roles are roles that connect the person who engages or creates or modifies or does something to a resource, and the resource is what we have created, right? I'm going to stretch your brain a little bit on the thing we created a bit here in the next one, but essentially we have agents have a relationship to an item or a described concept, okay? And the importance of these roles are for historicity or provenance in archives terms. So my research is founded in more archival study. I have a master's in linguistics, but right now I'm in archival studies. It's important for credit. So there's two journals that I know of that have said that the OLAC roles are great for adding like the role of somebody in a citation and reference part. I have some reservations about that, but we see this more often in journals where there's an ontology out there called credit for, you know, whose role was it in the creation of this paper, right? So importance of roles in our academic scholarship and the outputs thereof. Roles are important in search and discovery. So if you go to an online search system and you want to find all the materials by Mark Twain, he's or you have a name, right? You can search by name, but you can also search by, limit that then, Mark Twain author rather than Mark Twain subject. Indirect resource genre information. And so what I mean by this is like an interviewee is different than a dancer. So if we have a role of dancer, we probably have a video material or a visual materials in some way. And so this leads us to the idea of the event of doing. Something has happened that is allowed this agent to do something. And these need to be documented for when we're creating information systems for describing roles that are going to help people beyond us understand the resources that we create. So as language documenters, we create video materials, text materials, audio materials, transcriptions. We need people, after we're gone, to understand those materials and how they came about. So from some of the roles and thinking about frames, so roles are not independent, they're grounded in frames. Thinking about an educational frame, we have the tertiary context of education is what I mean here. The organizer of a meeting. We all have been in meetings. Most of us have had degrees where we have a degree committee member or a degree granting institution. And these are all roles that exist in the MARC vocabulary. The archival frame is really important to me as an archivist, but also important to all of us as we engage with archives and how we engage with the different parts of the archive and what people do in those places. So for instance, a donor doesn't mean necessarily the person that gives money, but that would be a sponsor. But a donor might be the person who turns over ownership of materials to the archive for stewardship, permanent stewardship and ownership by the memory institution. So these are some of examples of agent frames, and we work with these then in resource life cycles. And what I want you to do in your notes is be thinking about frames and reference frames, and what are the reference frames for the roles that you've encountered in your work? What are the pathways that you use to create new media, annotations of old media, new life in old media, like you've recycled something and reused it in a new way? So this information, we think about this as an archival context. So we're the organization that kind of pushes this around. So we have different steps in the organization of when we take in material, we organize it and describe it, and we want to know who the creators were. We have a validation process on the materials. We set it up for search and retrieval. We get rid of the stuff that we expunge some stuff as required, and we enable other people to create new stuff. It's going backwards here. Let's see. There we go. So taking that same process and looking at it linearly instead of circularly, here are some roles along the bottom. And thinking about frames, it's important to think about things in terms of time and how often they happen. So serial versus monographic. Serials are like journals. They happen over and over and over and over and over again. Monographic is kind of like, it's a stable thing. It's just one thing. And oftentimes when we think about roles, there's managerial roles in projects, and there's line level roles in projects. People helping to organize structure, like maybe the navigator in a project, from using a term from yesterday's presentation, to the person who's doing the recording and the speaking or the signing, right? We have these roles are often specified by media type. So text, sound, imagery, moving images, software, archives, collections. So a collection will have a different kind of role for somebody who organizes it than somebody who edits paper. All right, so what frames and roles do they contain? So thinking about now OLAC has been very influential for linguists thinking about roles. It was as I understand it, was a ground up collection of roles that were then looked at in the context of MARC roles. But there's a note there in the description of the taxonomy that says, well, we need to ask other kinds of linguists, but this note, what roles they have. But this note was over 20 years ago, and we need to revisit this question, not just in our community, but in the psycholinguistics community and the theoretical linguistics community, I guess, as well. And so I want to ask you today, let's see, this is going the wrong way. Let's see. And there we go. We got some sort of action here with the buttons. All right. What are the media processing workflows used in the creation of language resources, and what are the contextual frames in which language resources are created and transformed? So everyone here has done, quote, language documentation or is interested in doing language documentation, but there are certain workflows that we do. And in the hard sciences and the STEM sciences, we can cite a methodology. We can publish a methodology and we can cite it, give it a DOI. I don't see that happening in language documentation, in part because our methodology is so diverse. We often cite a paper that will cite somebody's method that we're trying to replicate. We've had a discussion here about cut verbs and using different videos, and that's, in general, in broad strokes, a type of methodology. And we do kind of that thing. But if we were to think about our work as how did that video, edited or not, or how did that Elan file, edited or not, come into existence? What was who touched it? What happened along the way to make that? When did I use AI assistance or an NLP process with editing from a human feedback in the loop, and who was that human, what was their, in the process of enriching the transcription or the translation. Those are the things that I'm hoping you would help me by taking a note, copying it into this common thing. The document that you went to, and say, think about your own context, and think about what is the workflow, whatever, if you're working with video, if you're working with text, if you're working with audio, these are the three most, but maybe you're working with software too, along the way. Maybe it's how a collection of materials comes together for you. Maybe you are working in an archive, or what are the roles that you engage with, the different kinds of things that you engage with for thinking about new resources or the reuse of resources. And what's really helpful is not just the title of that, but also the context of it. Because if we say donor and we don't have an archival context, we wouldn't necessarily think about someone who brings a physical artifact to a museum. We might be thinking about someone who gives money to a nonprofit or something like this. And so understanding these in our context helps us when we go to build search interfaces for archives. Having a common semantics helps us build and test. In my area, there's a lot of user interface testing. So we test something to see who's engaging with it. And so having this input is helpful to me, and helpful in reserving the language documentation community to say, hey, this is a way that people are thinking about their resource production, the pipeline processes of producing things, and then the roles involved in that. So understanding the context, the new context that you see in new ways. And I was very glad to hear about the navigator. It's not just a project manager, but it helps you navigate culture and context. And that was a learning point for me. But what is that for you guys? So, and I'll say thank you. And I'll open it up for questions.
Let's thank our speaker. Are there any comments and questions? It made me think of generalized semantic roles back at university when you classify agent into agent experiencer, all of this. There's a question from the chat.
Gitas asked, I may have a problem to understand the non-mutually exclusive role constructions. Can you elaborate a bit?
Non-mutually exclusive role constructions. If we're not talking about semantics here, we're talking about resource production. Is non-mutually exclusive. So in everyday semantics in English anyway, some terms that we might use if we were to say performer versus dancer, one has more specificity. In general, when we're, as an archivist, if we have both options, we want to use the most specific option available to us. So that's the way that we would treat, overlap cases. If we don't have a specific option, obviously, then we don't really have an option. So if there's an option for specificity, we go with specificity.
I don't know. I have some things that I've been wondering about in the context of the California Language Archive. I don't have necessarily a specific question, but I'm thinking of a few issues related to roles. One is that, in my experience, depositors want to use as few roles as possible because it just, like, you can get into the weeds about sort of over distinguishing the roles that different people have had at different times. And so I would just be curious, like, whether you think such a behavior is generally good or generally bad. The other thing I'm thinking of is that in our catalog we have a suggested citation field for collections that generate lists of authors based on roles, and it's just a suggested citation, but we've chosen to prioritize certain roles over others to get them higher up in the author list. So someone labeled as speaker or consultant gets bumped up and then is alphabetized amongst each other over researchers, for example, or depositors. I'm also sort of curious to your reaction to that kind of thing.
Sort order is really interesting because in the hard sciences, the PI usually goes on the end. And so if you're in the front, then it means that you're new to the game, I guess. So how that works in language documentation, sub-practice of publishing, and citation and reference, I'm not sure there is a right and wrong on that. But putting data inputter on something may be useful if it's a data set, because you're showing like how it progressed. I have a paper coming out shortly where my data set that I query a lot is the OLAC data set, and this is a data set generated by archives that submit their data to a common catalog. So it's not necessarily everything in their catalogs. But when I look at that, one of the things that's not often available is the historicity of the resource, or how it came in through a field called provenance. And it's very helpful to understand, if you have 5 or 6 roles attached to an item, what the historical narrative of that object was, and that would be clarified in the provenance statement. So I think in terms of the first part of your question, the fewest number of roles was kind of the original feedback, from what I've understand from people who helped develop the system. But I think specificity is needed in cases if we can't define the frame of reference. I mean.
Thank you. 2 things. I think for your question, in the hard sciences, very often now you get precisions about who has done what in lists of authors. So who's provided the data set, who's provided the main ideas and hypotheses and so on. And I think this is nicely already there because of the labels that you have as different contributors. So probably the order is not so important as keeping information about who did what, and then people can decide what is important for them in terms of contribution. So that's just a side remark. The rest is about, so I'm always into my thinking about auto-documentation and what speakers contribute. So generally what they contribute and what they want to have is something that, if they're contributing a video on a traditional activity, is mainly what the model for them is the mainstream documentary. So the question, the model in my region would be that kind of thing. There's also community discussions about who should be put there because they're important and because they sort of did something, so not necessarily like in a film. But I think for users who deposit directly, it's important to kind of, again, link the archival roles to their representations, and maybe use correspondence tables or things like that.
You mean by correspondence tables? Help me understand.
For instance, if they say réalisateur, for instance, for their documentary, réalisation, comment on dit, filming, and that sort of thing, that names would appear in this. So if you don't have this in OLAC, to have a kind of, first of all, I mean, there's a question of the language, of course, but once you've sort of got the translation, let's say in a main language like French or English, let's say filming, then you have to somehow relate that role, which they consider important in their production, to one of the roles that you have in OLAC, and that's what I call macro role. That is, does it go with author? Does it go with creator? Does it go with blah, blah? And so maybe there's something also to be reflected at this level, so that it's also, it meets the needs of contributors and is not just people who have to.
I follow.
Yes, as a quick follow-up on Amina's question, I should do publicity for work by Aurélia Vasile, who is a trained librarian and archivist, and she took the OLAC catalog for the Pangloss collection and thought about how to project it onto the DOI catalog, because people asked us, they clamored for DOI, so we have an overlay of DOIs, and it was an opportunity to translate metadata which are OLAC tailored for speech onto, you know, sort of disappointing DOI Thomson Reuters metadata tailored for papers, basically. And we wanted to do something quick and dirty, but that was not at all her style. So she did something which I find very beautiful. So there's a paper that she wrote about the whole process. And you can also just grab a DOI from Pangloss, put it in Zotero, it'll import the reference, and see what compromises were made and whether that makes sense at all. Because in case of a recommended citation, when we thought about who comes first and next, and we have a text export, then people sometimes re-encode it into Zotero or something because they're asked to format it in a certain way that's specific. And so that I find was, and if you have feedback because you think some things should be improved, we're also very happy to continue the conversation. Yeah.
Yes, Alex, Elise and I have discussed this at length before, and I cite her work in my master's thesis. So, and I tested it out, and I tested, in my master's thesis, I tested Zotero with 5 archives, and Pangloss comes out the best.
Okay, so I'm afraid we ran out of time. So let's all send our notes to you, and let's give him another round of applause. Thank you.